So this presentation explores what a meaningfully posthumanist, if not a genuinely feminist, filmmaking style might look like. The problem is typically, this sort of problem is typically framed as a question of inventing or reinventing the language of film in order to audiovisually represent or mediate a heretofore or under or misrepresented experience. I'm just going to move through my slides, some of my slides more quickly. But what of those experiences that might best be addressed or better be addressed on screen, either indirectly or not at all? To this end, I briefly compare these three films that Maya just mentioned, all from 2022, She Said and Women Talking, directed by Maria Schrader and Sarah Polley, respectively, and Polley also adapted her screenplay. And also Tar, written and directed by Todd Field, who is a man. I compare them on the basis of their mutual yet diverse engagement with innovative approaches to cinematic representation. Representation signifies here as both the making present again of what is now absent, the profilmic event, the referent, and so on. And also in the more political sense, so to speak, of making space for heretofore underrepresented faces, voices, or identities. In this case, those of women, broadly speaking. Not that women have gone unrepresented in film, of course. Rather, these particular films all engage with the challenge of translating difficult, controversial, or ethically problematic material into the audiovisual language of film through the deliberate and strategic avoidance of any conventional or expected tropes, effects, or scenic structures, most notably something like the male gaze, for example. In short, each of these, of the three Me Too or post-Me Too films, in its own way meets the challenge of the sexual and or emotional violence at the core of its respective story by avoiding all explicit visual reference in an audiovisual medium, ironically, in which the visual historically dominates. Instead, each film exploits sound, off-screen space, mise en scène, camera movement, and especially editing to allude to, suggest, or gesture towards that which cannot, or for various reasons should not, be shown. In meeting such formal and stylistic challenges, each film also represents a different manifestation of an apotropaic feminist posthumanist cinema, or at least that's what I'm calling it, itself representative of a larger critique of an anthropocentric and anthropomorphic world. At the center of this world is the humanist masculinist subject, looking out from its privileged perspective on those others whose voices and identities, however indirectly or ironically, are now beginning to find expression. By Me Too or post-Me Too film, I refer very broadly to narrative fiction or documentary feature films produced since 2017, when the social media hashtag #MeToo was used, I quote, as a way to draw attention to the magnitude of the problem. I think we all know what the problem is. These are films which deal on the level of content or story more or less directly with issues of systemic gender discrimination, the objectification of women in the media, rampant sexual abuse both on and off screen, including sexual violence, especially rape. And in this regard, the films She Said and Women Talking are especially relevant. This set of issues opens out into the wider cultural surround in which the politics of identity focused around gender drive a lot of the media content that we consume daily. And here Tar becomes very relevant. And you can see how we all are aware how complex this is, since one has to address both what's going on in a given film text or other kind of text in relation to what's going on in the world outside, off screen, the real world, so to speak. So it's very complicated and difficult situation. So what do I mean by apotropaic cinema? I do not use apotropaic, I should say, in the cultural anthropological sense, whereby an object or artwork in a specific context is assigned talismanic value in order to ward off evil, so to speak. But I can't resist noting that in classical antiquity, and I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but one of the most common examples of an apotropaic object or symbol was a statue of an oversized phallus, embodying a sacred masculine generative power as a safeguard against evil. But we have to, that's a digression we can't follow right now. I invoke this term here, literally meaning not simply to turn away, but more literally to put tropes away or to one side, to avoid figures of speech. from the Greek for to turn away, from to turn away, or trope, of course, is present there in the word. Apotropaic is thus in the same family rhetorically as apophasis, or ironic denial, rhetorical terms that name the avoidance of rhetorical terms. I extend into film style or language, therefore, the paradoxical aesthetic strategies championed by innovators in modernist and contemporary literature alike. Which is why I have a couple of examples from Samuel Beckett. More obviously, perhaps you might think of Hemingway or Cormac McCarthy with their taut masculine prose, if I can put it that way. This apotropaic stylistic tendency may or may not be more marked in such manly writers, but arguably Beckett, who's also a famous male writer, provides the best example while complicating such masculinist cliches. Beckett's rigorous avoidance of unnecessary stylistic adornment, especially in his later prose works, represents an extreme, in turn harrowing and hilarious example of the epistemological and ontological implications of the discursive constitution of human subjectivity. This is just to provide the sort of context here for how I'm talking about these films. Apotropaic here means to avoid figures, tropes or figures, metaphor, and therefore metaphysics, ultimately representation in the onto-aesthetic sense as a making present again. So it's a complication of the question of representation. In other words, taken to its logical extreme, an apotropaic cinema, like the modern and pre-modern literature that predates it, eschews many or most of the received conventions for reproducing or mediating certain aspects of reality or certain kinds of experience, either replacing them with other more radical techniques or with discursive techniques that gesture positively toward the withholding of the image, a positive quantity that ironically represents a negativity or absence. In this context, then, an apotropaic film style avoids the conventions and cliches of the filmic representation of women, especially in an objectified, sexualized context, and most particularly where psycho-emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or violence, or even rape, is at the center of the story. I inflect this essentially feminist approach also with the concerns of critical posthumanism, which extends and complicates feminism's groundbreaking critique of the Enlightenment humanist masculine subject, which is already something that's happening, or that's been happening for a while. I'm just skipping over some sections here to get right to the films. So now, yeah, sorry, I have to skip over. Adapted from New York Times reporters Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor's 2019 best-selling nonfiction account, the film She Said dramatizes their investigation into the decades-long abuse of women by Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. Notice I didn't even think about it, but I didn't include his image in these slides at all. That was just an unconscious thing. Weinstein and the system that supported him and others like him. Twohey and Kantor's efforts were instrumental in the emergence of the Me Too movement, which has uncovered comparable cases involving women worldwide. Schroeder's film, here's Maria Schroeder here, Schroeder's film is a recent instance of the investigative journalism drama. Like She Said, here are the two lead actors in the film as they first appear in character, emerging out of in the New York City streets out of a number of different women, sort of random women that the camera picks out. So they emerge just as two more women amongst all the other women in New York streets, which is an interesting way to introduce them. Like She Said, Polly's Women Talking, the film, is adapted from the book, Miriam Tave's 2018 novel of the same title. Canadian writer Miriam Taves. And Sarah Polley is a Canadian filmmaker. And the book is based in true events. In the early 2010s, a group of women, including very young girls and older women, in a remote and isolated Mennonite colony in Bolivia, discovered that for some years, the men in their colony had been drugging them nightly with bovine tranquilizer and raping them in their sleep. And this was a true item in the news you may have seen. The novel's action, which fictionalizes this story, unfolds over 2 days as the women meet while the men are away, posting bail for their comrades, to discuss what course of action to take. The film retains this plot while transposing events into a more universalized Anglophone Mennonite context. And in fact, this film was shot not far from where I'm sitting right now and talking to you in the Ontario countryside. Tar, The odd film out here is an original story written and directed by American Todd Field in the sort of grand auteurist tradition. No slight against Field, of course. Described as a psychological drama, Tar tracks the undoing and fall of classical megastar conductor Lydia Tarr, played by Cate Blanchett, an openly gay woman brought down in a sexual misconduct scandal. In telling the story of a fictional person, he abuses their power to extract attention, adulation, and perhaps sexual favors from younger women who stand to gain from the relationship. Tar reflects and inverts the issues of She Said and other Me Too era narratives by replacing Weinstein, so to speak, with a powerful white lesbian. This revitalizes a story that might have seemed otherwise derivative and tired, had it featured a straight white male protagonist. Even more than the other two films, Tar's more significant innovations occur, however, not on the level of story, but on that of film style, I would argue. Of the three films, and these films are all very different and very worth watching if you haven't seen them. Of the three, I think that Tar is probably the most innovative on the formal level, although that might also be said for Women Talking. So with a very few examples from each of these films, in the longer version of this presentation, I show the necessity of attending to the complexities and contradictions of contemporary filmmaking in the Me Too era, an historical moment in which the long-standing challenges of reconciling some sort of feminist agenda to the mundane task of cinematic storytelling are crystallized on the level of style, structure, and sound design. As Rebecca Harrison observes of She Said, for instance, sorry, I have to just skip ahead again. I guess I thought I had this quotation, but anyway. In one chilling scene, and I have the clip here, but I won't show it right now. This is a screen capture. In one chilling scene in She Said, as a disembodied camera advances eerily down 4 different empty hotel corridors in sequence, we hear on the soundtrack, Ambra Batelana Gutierrez's covert recording of an encounter with Weinstein on the soundtrack. Blending dramatic and documentary elements in a film about believing women risks creating tension between fiction and truth. But in She Said, it works to bolster the film's authenticity. That was Harrison. This blending, however, is as much about what is left out of the scene. There are no visual subjects, not even actors, in this protracted sequence. The voices on the soundtrack are those from the actual recording, and the disembodied camera, as it were, manifests a feminist, critically posthumanist gaze. This gaze returns in a later scene, arguably. Weinstein. Oh, sorry, that's the clip. This kind of gaze returns in a later scene in the film, She Said, in which Laura Madden, or an actor, sorry, playing the real person, Laura Madden, in voiceover recounts her experience of rape by Weinstein as the camera lingers on their hotel room, empty but for discarded clothes and so forth. In Women Talking, interestingly, Polly extends this kind of technique across a montage of empty interior spaces, as you see on the right-hand side here. She makes even more overt, more self-reflexive use of this with the voiceover over top of static shots of significant interior sort of domestic spaces, kitchens typically, with this very significant dialogue over top. In She Said, neither Weinstein nor any of his crimes are depicted, except as in this manner, with an actor playing Weinstein always with his back to the camera. You never actually see anybody who looks like Weinstein. So neither Weinstein nor any of his crimes are actually depicted, whether in archival footage or in reenactment. As an audio artifact, the Gutierrez recording is a singular exception. Also, people like Ashley Judd, celebrities like Ashley Judd play themselves. Other celebrities like Rose McGowan are played by actors. Gwyneth Paltrow's voice is really her voice. So it's a real mixture of techniques. Instead, the film, She Said, pays relentless attention to the women, the real women, ultimately, to their faces and bodies as they relate their experiences, reliving the trauma retroactively. Trauma is the operative term for all 3 films here, although the cinematic treatment of trauma may or may not align with its clinical off-screen interpretation. Either way, the key is memory, trauma relived in memory, traumatic memory, paradigmatically the aftermath of sexual violence, and the relative representability of such extreme experience. In a nutshell, these films epitomize, even as they question, the contemporary preoccupation with the traumatic backstory as justification for the protagonist's present condition, a story structure that you see all over the place nowadays in film and television. Cinema is an aid to memory, even as it is a modality of memory in itself. But there are times when what is necessary is neither memory, as what Richard Turdiman calls the making present of the past, nor forgetting, but rather the strategic marshaling of negation and absence. Alongside dramatized interviews with victims and other techniques, similar techniques, numerous flashbacks in She Said illustrate the women's accounts, but always with the focus on the women's younger self and then the aftermath of her trauma, as we see in these examples. In all of these scenes, actual victims are played by actors. Likewise, in Women Talking, none of the rapes are depicted on screen. There is instead a repeated motif of a high-angle shot of a woman waking up from a drug-induced sleep to find her nightdress crumpled and bloodied, the trauma literally irrecuperable because of the effects of the cow tranquilizer. These two are intercut as literal flashbacks in the clinical sense of a PTSD flashback, where the term flashback, though, occurs first historically in cinema. And She Said, by contrast, the flashbacks provide substantive narrative content, repeatedly reinforcing the women's common experience of sexual violence, followed for far too long by societal indifference or ignorance. The latter is invoked with poetic economy as Schrader repeatedly lingers on or cuts back in scene after scene to someone that the reporters have just interviewed, usually but not always a man, as he or she is struck by the full weight of the realization of his or her complicity in the support system that enabled Weinstein's abusive behavior for decades. So these scenes are sort of redundant narratively, since they linger on an individual simply pondering something. Rebecca Harrison argues that She Said seems to be burdening survivors with going public with the trauma to fix a world they did not break. And off-screen, she goes on, recent accusations against Brad Pitt, one of the film's producers, She Said's producers, point to its unfortunate entanglement in the system it critiques. Rather than shoring up a simplistic Manichaean argument, however, I think this example shows the degree in which the film, She Said, is in fact symptomatic of the complexities and contradictions of contemporary filmmaking in the Me Too era. After all, the very same argument can be directed against a hugely successful film like David Fincher's Fight Club from 1999, which, as a sophisticated cultural commodity starring Brad Pitt, overtly satirized the consumer capitalist industrial complex of which it was eminently representative. And speaking of Pitt, that She Said is partially financed through Pitt's Plan B production company, which is also the case with Women Talking, is a real-world instance of the unintentional ironies and contradictions generated by an inadequately reflective hyper-awareness of others' moral ethical failings, what Lydia Tarr labels the siloing off of what is acceptable or not acceptable. Tarr's own downfall as protagonist in Field's film is predicated on her own tragic blindness in herself to what she sees so clearly in others. And I have to just skip over these examples of these wonderful scenes in the film that illustrate this. Because more significant for my argument here are the films, and this is my last point, the film Tar's many moments in which an unexpected self-reflexivity enters in, most obviously in the two dream sequences, as we see here. From the film's opening shot, we know that Lydia is already haunted, as it says on the smartphone here, by her conscience, although we do not know why. This is the opening frame of the film. Many and various clues throughout the film indicate a relationship gone wrong with a former student, Krista Taylor, that you can sort of see here in the extreme foreground. Krista appears in frame twice early on, observing Lydia with us from a distance. Then, partway through the film, Lydia learns that Krista has committed suicide. But Krista returns in Lydia's dreams, her face always shrouded in the telltale long hair. We never see her face in the film. In a pair of intermediate scenes, though, Lydia reacts with a sudden look toward the camera, in a quasi-direct address that, in a gesture recalling Michael Haneke's camera in Cachet from 2005, manifests her guilty conscience directly through film form, I would argue. You can't see the examples on the right, but the same kind of thing is happening where the actors look up suddenly in shock, as if they were suddenly surprised by the camera, and then there's a sort of a jump away in an edit. In the end, the narrative of She Said achieves formal and thematic closure, ratified with the seal of real historical hindsight. Weinstein was already convicted and at the start of a long prison sentence before the film even opened. And so in this sense, this is the most conventional of the three films, but that's not a criticism. Women Talking, by contrast, concludes with the resolution of the central debate, what they should do in that situation, how they should react, while the women's ultimate fate remains open, which is perhaps appropriate given the film's quasi-allegorical texture. Tar, once again, the odd film out, is the most ambiguous in its ending, its protagonist seemingly embarking on a new journey into the heart of the opaque darkness of her own interior life. And I will stop there.